Okay, and we are live. Just starting a few minutes early to make sure all the tech stuff is in fact working. I don't actually know how I can see if people are here, but if you're joining us, we're just going to start with a little gathering question. Hey, Lena, thanks for letting me know. Awesome. So we're officially starting on top of the hour, but I went ahead and set this up just in case. It's my first stream, so I wanted to make sure. Good evening. Hello, folks. So as you're trickling in, I have a gathering question you can answer in the chat if you'd like, which is just, do you have any experience with tarot? The answer could be no, not at all. And if you do, you can maybe say a little bit about, are you a reader, you're a student, you're a newbie, have a little exposure. And the question is, what is a swords card that you have struggled to understand? So if you're familiar with the swords in the tarot, then what's a card that you've maybe struggled to understand or found difficulty with or just don't like when you pull it? And we'll start there. And then we'll get started in just a minute. And I just reflexively started, I have some tarot cards in front of me to show throughout this, and I reflexively just started shuffling them and then went, no, they're actually in a specific order. Oops. So we're going to get started in just a few minutes if you're joining. And if you're seeing this on the recording or the replay, hopefully I have the ability to put a timestamp for you so you can jump ahead to the actual beginning. I just thought of that, but I think we'll be okay. I can see folks coming in. Okay, cool. So I see a couple folks starting to trickle in. Welcome. We're just going to get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you for joining. All right, Six of Swords. So I asked a gathering question if you're just joining us, which is just, do you have any experience or exposure to tarot? The answer can be no. The answer can be advanced. It's going to be good for everyone. And if you are a little familiar with the swords, then the question you can answer in the chat is, what is a swords card that you struggled to understand or found difficult? You can drop that in the chat. Welcome, folks. Give it just another minute and we'll go ahead and get started. Can actually type that. Oh, thank you, Miss Avarice. I appreciate you. I literally had the thought as you were typing that, so we're on a wavelength. This is my first time using the YouTube live platform, and 30 minutes before this, I was like, I'm just going to make sure everything's good. And it was like, we don't think you have a camera or a microphone. So thank God I got that figured out. This is one of the helpful things about being a tarot, astrology, woo-woo person who also has a background in tech. But I don't completely lose it when it doesn't work. But awesome. So we have some answers to our gathering questions. Struggle to understand the 10 of Swords. Yes, it's really dramatic imagery in the 10. Doing it for a few years now. Awesome. So as folks are joining, you can continue to answer the gathering question, which is, do you have familiarity with tarot? And if you do already, what's a swords card that you've struggled to understand or found difficult? But I am going to go ahead and get started because we are at 4 o'clock my time. And I think we're about ready to go. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I am super excited about this offering. Just to give you a quick introduction to myself, if you are not familiar with my work, my name is Avery Fawcett, and I help folks who are passionate about liberation and justice to find themselves and their roles in an emerging future. I am a change doula, and I strongly believe in the alchemy of personal healing and growth, kind of feeding into and being fed from bigger collective change. So that intersection of healing and justice is really strong in my work. And I say change doula because change, both internal and external, and being able to alchemize those two, and doula in the sense that I really want to provide supportive spaces and steward folks through different kinds of transitions. I also just want to acknowledge that I am coming to you from unceded and stolen lands that are traditional resource gathering places for a number of different Native peoples, including the Sequaliupsh and Spoyalabupsh peoples, and I want to acknowledge them as well as the land itself that does sustain my work. If you, I see folks are coming in the chat and sharing a little. Looks like we've got some folks who are a little newer and some folks who are more advanced. It's awesome. If you did just find out about me through this specific offer, I will note that I've got links below in the description. You can open in a new tab if you want to follow me on all the places, social, etc. But I will admit that I especially love writing for my newsletter. And so if you signed up for this, you will get next week's companion email series that it goes along with this event. And I hope that you'll stick around after. You will automatically just be opted in. I send emails generally no more than once a week, but you can also manage your settings at the bottom of the emails and kind of opt in and out of different lists if you need to. But that is really where I pour a lot of my heart and a lot of my own magic in. So I hope folks will enjoy that. I also tend to prioritize YouTube. And so if you like video content, go ahead and hit that. Hit that subscribe, smash that bell, whatever they say, but you can go ahead and do that. There may be some folks, I don't know, joining just because they saw this went up live on YouTube. So if that is you and you didn't actually sign up, that's okay. This is a totally free offer, including this event and emails next week. So go ahead and hit the link in the description for Heart-Centered Swords. You can just quickly type in your first name and email. You can do that right now in a new tab, and that will make sure that you get next week's materials. So go ahead and do that now because you'll want to do it before they come out. And if yeah, and I also just wanted to quickly mention a little bit about my business model. It is inspired by Sacred Economics, if anybody's read that book and the concept of sacred economics. And I have a real desire to serve folks whether or not they have financial resources. So obviously this is a free offer. And, you know, if you have capacity to support my work being sustainable and being available to everyone, and you feel called to do so, I do have a way to do that. There is a link to Patreon below. That's also always at the bottom of my emails. And so like, I really encourage folks to experience the work first, see if you get something out of it. And, you know, if you receive value, or you just want others to be able to access it, then you can contribute there at the Patreon link. I am right now running a special that I'm calling the Founders Tier for early supporters, because I'm really trying to like spread the word and build the folks who are part of my world. And so I want to honor folks who support early. If you are watching this live, you can just know that that Founders Tier is going to be open until my birthday, March 2nd. And so, you know, get in there by then if you're interested. At a $10 a month level, there's some perks you can read about on the Patreon, and I'll mention them at the end. So just a quick kind of run of show what we're doing here, and welcoming everybody who's joining us. The thing we're going to do is first, we're going to just make sure quickly that you're in the right place. I'm going to tell you why heart-centered swords. So what is this? How did I get here? We're going to explore what are the swords about, in my view. What is their kind of theme? And then what is my vision for this heart-centered swords, which is really like a healthy integrated sword suit. And what does that look like? What's the highest potential of the swords? We will journey through each card. So if you're totally unfamiliar, you're in the right place. Don't worry. We're going to take a look at each of the cards in the suit, and then we will have Q&A at the end. So I'll try to like a little bit glance at the chat, but to be honest, I've got a fair bit of material, and it's hard to like divide my focus. So if anything is like really urgent and unclear, you could just type Avery in all caps to try to get me to see it. But generally, I will be answering questions at the end. We'll have plenty of time for that. So if something sparks in your brain, you can just jot it down, and we'll have plenty of opportunity for questions and discussion at the end. I also totally encourage you to use that chat to talk amongst yourselves, react to what I'm saying, share your own experiences. And, there is going to be a fair amount of talking in this one before we get to the Q&A, which is kind of contrast to how I normally teach, is really interactive. But since we have such a like broad potential audience for this, I want to make sure everybody can kind of get in there and understand. And so I hope you'll still find it engaging. The email series next week is really going to be deeply interactive and accessible. There's going to be like tons of resources and exercises for like all different things. So like tarot spreads, if you are a reader, journal prompts, somatic like body exercises, things you can do with other people. So there'll be tons of ways that you can engage with this material in the emails, as well as having our Q&A at the end of this. We are going to have, I scheduled up to 2 hours. I don't know if we'll actually need 2 hours together today, but I've scheduled 2 hours, which includes like a good half hour for questions. If you do need to jump, it will be recorded. This will show up, and I'll drop the recording link on Monday in the email. And also, if you're just doing stuff, you're cooking dinner and you need to listen, that's totally fine. You don't have to participate in the chat, but you can. I do want to ask, if you know somebody who this might resonate with, if you get to the end of this and are like, wow, I want to share this with somebody, please do. I'm really trying to bring people kind of into my orbit. But instead of sending them just like the link to this YouTube, send them the actual link that you used to sign up, which is down in the description, to Heart-Centered Swords sometime this weekend, so that they will get the email series. So let's start with who are you? I said who I am. So I'm guessing that you might be one of the following. You might be a tarot person who just finds the swords to be a little intimidating, confusing, scary, etc., or just frustrating. You might be somebody who primarily considers yourself to be like a mental person or a logical person, and maybe you're kind of a little bit turned off by the way that you've been taught or learned that swords are associated with brain and the mind, and then you see the pictures and are like, wow, this seems kind of negative. Or maybe you're just somebody who in general considers yourself to be very mental, and you're not sure like where to fit into more spiritual practices. Maybe sometimes you feel like, I'm not really like woo enough. You also might honestly like not know a dang thing about tarot, but you resonate with some of the themes that we're covering in this offering. So whether it's that you feel kind of disconnected from others, maybe you get kind of stuck in old stories or patterns that you want to change, mental thought patterns. Maybe you're really drawn to like imagining a visionary future, and it feels like everything is on fire right now. You might want to relate to others around stories and ideas, but you also might have social anxiety or ADHD or other neurodivergencies or things that make it harder to connect. Or maybe you're just generally struggling with like, how do I, balance my belief in a better world and my passion for justice with my own healing and my exhaustion. All these things are going to come up throughout this program today, and then in the emails next week. So my invitation right now is just to be present. Maybe we'll like just take a deep breath together. Welcome folks who've just come in. So I'm inviting you to just be present, to listen with an open mind, to engage in the chat if you'd like. And then next week, as you receive the emails, you can work with them in the ways that feel most relevant. So you might, set yourself some time each evening to go through them, or maybe it takes you a year to go through them. It really doesn't matter. There's going to be a lot there. So, I'm just opening it up to you. I really want to offer from my heart. And as folks often say in the kind of witchy communities, take what you like and leave the rest. So I'm not putting myself forward. I never put myself forward as like an authority. A lot of this just comes from my own experience and things I've noticed. And I would love for you to, again, engage in the chat and offer your, possibly contradicting viewpoints. I will, by the way, read the chat after this is done. So if you do put something in there that's for me and I don't get to it live, I'll drop it in the comments on the video once it goes up. So let's get started. Why heart-centered swords? What the heck is this? So this particular offering really started to come together for me when I had a conversation with my dear friend Catherine about the Three of Swords specifically. So in the tarot, if you don't know, swords are typically taught as being related to the mind, thinking, communication, and then the three, which I can grab my Three of Swords here, the three looks like this, is one of the scarier cards to see, right, in the tarot. You've got this heart being stabbed by three swords. And this is often described or taught as being about like emotional pain or heartbreak. And so there was kind of, I think Catherine and I started talking about the kind of dissonance between, well, if this is the suit of the mind, and like, why is there this heartbreaky card? Like, is that what this card means? So I've been kind of thinking about that specific card and like, how do you reconcile those two things? And in the meantime, I was encountering different systems that use elements and what they had to say about the air element specifically, which is the element air that is associated with the swords, at least in the Smith-Rider-Waite system, which is one of the most common systems that a lot of tarot decks are based on. So I was learning tarot and astrology, specifically Hellenistic and modern astrology based on Hellenistic. And both of those systems, I was learning the air was about the mind and communication and thinking, so like kind of associated with the brain. And I also was learning that the heart, things like emotions and relationships would go with cups, not with the swords. And I was reading this book. So I've been thinking about this for a while, and I've been reading this a book by Anadea Judith about the chakra system, specifically the chakra system as interpreted through a Western lens and this particular author, which may not be the same as the chakra system in its origin culture. But the way Judith explained it was that the heart chakra was associated, in her view, with air. And I was like, okay. So the cups and the tarot, heart goes with water. So now you're telling me heart goes with air, because that's a different take. And in this book, like one of the ways in which Judith explains that relationship between heart and air was like adaptability within relationship. The visual image that really stuck with me was about birds on a current, and the way that like a murmuration of birds responds. I bet Laura, you would know better than me. I see you're in the chat, but a murmuration of birds responds to shifting currents and to one another, and the way that they are in a flock, right? And thinking about that is like adaptability in relationships. So like heart and air, and I was like, that's interesting. And then I was also learning about human design a little bit, and in human design, heart is associated with ego and will and like a certain kind of drive, which is totally different from like relationships, emotions, or at least fairly different, right? Even physically, if you've seen a human design body graph, the heart is like down here. And then there's a center called the identity or G center that is where you would expect maybe the heart to go, that is about identity and love. And then you also have a throat center that has a lot to do with communication. And feel free if you want in the chat, if you have examples of like other elemental systems that you've worked with that are where air is associated with something other than the mind and communication and thinking, or where heart is associated with something interesting. You feel free to drop examples in the chat. There are tons of different systems, in different cultures, but thinking about this was really helping me to kind of trouble the neat like elemental division of like this element is this, and this element is this. And the association with kind of body centers. So the elements, or in the case of tarot, the suits, which go with elements, could address a few different things. They sometimes are said to address particular themes like emotion, passion, logic, or modalities, verbs like thinking, feeling, doing, or body centers like the heart, the gut. And a lot of times that's not the physical body, but it's the metaphorical kind of centers. And then underneath that, you might have some values. So like, is this system prioritizing a particular way of being over another one? Worth thinking about. I like to deconstruct everything. So there you go. And I just started like really noticing that it doesn't break down all that easily or obviously. So like, for example, if you think about communication, like what body center does communication go with? Think about that. You might say the throat, air, right? Think about breath and voice if that's part of your system, but so what I just asked is, what if I sign? What if I communicate with sign language? Then what, right? Not everybody communicates with their throat or voice. Some people type, right? And don't communicate with their voice. So is the hands communication, right? And then like you might associate communicating with your brain as well, because you're like processing information. There's logic involved, but we also communicate in relationship and from the heart. You've probably, tarot folks, you probably noticed this, right? That communication kind of shows up in the swords, and it also kind of shows up in the cups, and it could kind of show up in different places. And the more you think about it, the more you start to go down a rabbit hole of like, what even is emotion? What does it mean to be like brain led or spirit led or heart led? These are terms that I've heard people using. I have noticed that some sources can kind of fall into stereotypes. Like people will say things like, the air signs are all disconnected from their emotions. Okay, well, what does that mean? And like, I don't think that's true. And if you're an air sign, you might be like, what? Like that's, maybe you resonate with that, but maybe you don't. And my own neurodivergence and my own disability really led me to get curious about this, because I found that I tended to kind of exclude myself from certain parts of human experience because of how those ways of being or those themes were normed, and I wouldn't identify with them. And so it took some creativity for me to realize like, oh, I am that thing. I can do that thing. I just do it differently. So for example, I would pull from the cups, like say the 3 of cups. So this is generally considered like a fairly happy card. I would pull this and be like, oh no, please, please don't give me this card. I don't want this card. Because for me, social felt like a word, like right. But that didn't mean that I was totally in isolation. I had lots of friends, relationships, and people. Some of you are in this chat. Hey, lots of people in my life. But I would see this image of these folks. And, for me, social might be one-on-one. Social might not be like a bunch of people, drinking with their cups outside. It might be online, or it might be in my little cozy apartment here, or something else. So I had to shift my perspective, or like I would think of myself often as not very creative, not very like not having a lot of energy, because I have a chronic fatigue like condition that is currently more managed. But I would pull cards from the one suit, which is like drive, passion, energy. A lot of them look really like strong or really active, and I would just feel exhausted and be like, oh, no, like I don't want to have energy. Why are we doing this? So I had to think more creatively about the suits to fit in. And I think really all of these things, like feeling, thinking, whatever it is, happen in communication and integration. So if we come back to the tarot specifically, my general take, and we'll get more into it, is that all of the suits can address any themes. Some of you are probably on this train already, but this may be new to you. I think that each suit has a particular angle on those themes, but it's not a neat division. So I think this points to the unity, the network of both the human body and our lived experience. So our body doesn't neatly wall off different parts. It's all interconnected within us, right? And then when we interact with each other, we're not just using one modality, we're using all of them at the same time. Okay. So if we come back to the swords, I'm gonna tell you why, but I'm actually first gonna tell you when. So this offering in 2022 really seemed like a perfect time to do this, because we're currently collectively in a lover's year. There's a system where you can calculate, you can figure out what the year is associated with for all of us. And then there's also a way to do it personally. So for me personally, at least coming up after my birthday, I'll be in a justice year. So these two cards, Lovers and Justice. And by the way, the examples I've been showing are from the Modern Witch Tarot, but I will be showing from a few different decks, the Light Seers, the Lubanco Tarot, the Tarot of the Holy Spectrum, the Meraki, and I believe the This Might Hurt Tarot. So just to list those if you see images and are curious. But these cards represent our collective year, and this is personally 2022 for me. Both of these cards are associated with air signs in astrology, respectively Gemini and Libra, but they also to me have a really strong heart component. So the Lovers involves like working with your thoughts as a loving act, discerning the truth among stories. And then Justice is really about acknowledging and acting from truth, which to me feels very heart-centered. We'll talk a little bit about these cards at the end, but so that's why right now. And then if we come back to the question of why heart-centered swords, it really comes from my own personal relationship with the sword suit and how my understanding of it has changed. So back before Catherine asked me this question, I went down this rabbit hole. Starting out, when I first encountered the tarot about five years ago or so, I was like, okay, I learned the sort of like swords of the mind. And at that time I was like, great, like mental logic. I identified as very like intellectual and very like even as a trans person, I didn't want to connect to my body very much. As a person who'd gone through anxiety and depression, I was in a place where I kind of wanted to wall off my emotions. There were a lot of ways in which I just wanted to be in the mind as much as possible. So, I loved spreadsheets. And so when I learned about the swords, I was like, great, this is my suit, the swords. And then I learned about the story of the swords, and particularly the numbered cards in the swords, the minors in the Smith-Rider-Waite system, the particular visuals that are the basis for the cards I'll be showing today. And it was kind of like, oh. So I don't know, maybe some of you have had this experience when you kind of like, oh, like I want to be the mental person, but I don't know that I want to be the swords person, because there's a lot of the more tough cards in the tarot, at least in the minors, are found in that suit. And it really felt like the story arc or the progression of the story was that it was about something to overcome, which I was really resisting, because I was like, the mind isn't bad. And it felt like spiritual essentialism to me. It felt like saying that in order to be spiritual, we have to let go of our mind. And I didn't agree with that. It felt like the progression from ace to 10 in the swords was like the ending is we let go and we get rid of it all. I think someone mentioned the 10 of swords being a tough card. We're gonna get to that. So the more I sat with it and looked at these pictures and tried to sort of like work with the interpretations I've learned, it wasn't necessarily that I had a way to like make that minor story, that story arc, happy or positive. That's not what I'm promising here. But I came to see swords not as like the suit of the mind, but rather as the experience of learning to work with our brains, including our fears, our anxieties, our survival instincts, to work with our brains, but not to solely identify with the brain or the mind. So to use it as a single tool in our tool belt. And I think contextually, it totally makes sense if you think of it that way, that you might need a whole suit to address working with the brain, because we do live in a capitalist culture that tends towards over-reliance on logic over, say, spirit or emotion or like passion or relationship. And so the images in this story arc come out of this culture. So that's where we're starting here. And then if that's the swords, then why is it heart-centered swords? Well, I think we can look at the mind as sometimes really working with the heart and like truth and universal principles around like loving awareness, and sometimes not. If we're going to talk about heart-centered, like how I would define, what is kind of like heart work to me, I think it's not necessarily something that you can understand logically. I think it's the part of us. When I use the word heart, obviously it's a metaphor, but the heart to me, it's like the part of us that is really connected to our shared humanity and our role in a greater whole. It's the part of us that acts from love. And so emotions could be part of that. But when I say heart, I'm not just referring to emotions. Like emotions might be a signal, because I do think heart work is kind of intangible. And so emotions can kind of point us to it. But you could respond to your emotions in a loving way, but you could also respond to your emotions really not in a loving way. So to me, it's that intangible kind of loving energy. And I wanted to approach the swords in a heart-centered way, and think about how the heart might be engaged in swords work. So let's get into what is swords work. Yeah, Jenna notes feeling the same way about the Three of Cups and the Two of Cups. Sometimes that date energy. Yeah, absolutely. So what are the swords about? This is what we're going to talk about next, in my view. So again, not the suit of the mind, also not the suit of mental illness. I think it's important to note, because I have seen that interpretation. In general, I don't think that there is one suit of the mind, of the heart, or anything. So I would say that no one suit is about a single mode of being or a single body part. The secret of the tarot as a system, and the beauty of the tarot as a system, is oneness. And so each suit has an angle on that oneness. And I would also argue that every single suit teaches us about heart-centered living. I'm just focusing on the swords here because that's my interest, my entry point. So you might even say like the viewpoint of the tarot, if the tarot had a viewpoint, you might on the elements, you might even say that the key is integrating all our tools. So this is the Magician, the first card. If we consider the Fool as sort of overarching, the first card in the tarot has all of their tools, each element represented here, that they're using in integration. And I think that's really beautiful as a focus. So the swords, the angle the swords offers, in my view, is that it's the suit of learning to recognize patterns and stories. You might say mental frameworks, another way of thinking of that, but like patterns, stories, frameworks. The numbered cards in the swords, ace through 10, show us how we can get locked into particular patterns or stories. And there's also, I think, an association with the ego. The ego is not necessarily bad. It can be helpful in some ways, but it's also narrow. It's a narrow tool. Its whole job is to help us survive. So you could also think of like monkey mind, different ways of thinking about that kind of relationship with the brain. If you think of a literal sword, right, it's like very effective, but it's thin and it's sharp and it's got one job. It cuts, right? So I think we have to go through a lot of trial and error to learn how to work with that tool, with the brain as a tool, and not the whole tool belt, particularly because of the cultural focus on the mind. And also through that work, we learn discernment. We learn how to discern what is true. We're able to exercise our minds in ways that are aligned with our values, with our passion, with our inner knowing, our intuition. So back to the Magician as we integrate. So the swords teach us, I think, the strategic use of the brain. So knowing when to use it and when not to, knowing how to use it and where it fits into the bigger picture. So it points to where do our stories and our perspectives assist us and where do they get in the way? When do we need to call on logic and when do we need to set it aside? I noticed that a lot of the swords cards teach us, particularly the numbered ones, teach us about where using logic alone is harmful. But then when we get to the court cards in the swords, we can see some of the ways in which the mind can really shine. Like my pride in identifying with the mind, I think, comes out there once it's transcended all the stories that don't serve. Yeah, we're going to get to the other suits in a moment. So I'll briefly mention them as well. And this offering is about swords. I may in the future do offerings around the other suits, but so yeah, if we're leading from a place of whatever you want to call it, like soul, spirit, internal truth, I think we can form integration. I think we can form really beautiful stories and frameworks that help us to communicate and connect and collaboratively build. I think the courts really show us this, and especially the king. We'll get into that in the email series next week. We're going to be kind of building towards how do we do this beautiful connection and collaborative building. So the courts I see as being especially about using your voice, authentic speech and communication, discernment, and setting boundaries. If the swords is about patterns and stories, then I would say that the mind could be present in any of the suits. So to briefly answer your question, in my view, I would say that the wands teach us about drive and desire and passion and energy. Swords teach us about patterns and stories. The cups teach us about intuition, our emotions, our relationship with spirit, some of the kind of intangibles, things that might be hard to mentally understand. And then the pentacles teach us about physical realities and resources and how we manifest things into form. And by the way, I would say all of these suits teach us about being with each other. Another way to think of the suits might be that the wands represent the kind of spark or the energy, the excitement, a new thing, a drive. And then the swords are like the story of the framework that we start to build mentally to understand that, to put around that drive. The cups representing the kind of non-logical, intangible parts of ourselves that are maybe subconscious in some instances that are part of that. And then the pentacles are the embodiment of all of that and how it comes into form. And so the mind could be involved in all of these themes that I described. So with the wands, you might see mental energy as a wand, like the ways in which we get really lit up and driven and passionate by thinking, research, designing a system. If you're neurodivergent, maybe your special interests or hyperfixations could be wands. So some of my sort of passion for the swords and being I am a mental person, actually now some of those experiences, I might think more about the wands. Or I would think of all the suits, but the wands might come up and being really driven and excited about mental energy. With the pentacles, dealing with the tangible world, you might have a project that results from mental work. You might be using your mind to design a physical thing, to construct something maybe, or to make something. You also the pentacles might come up in how you think mentally and how you think about the body, your resources, engages the mind, but it's still kind of pentacles work. And then the cups might point to the way that we interpret our intuitive insights. So the modes in which we receive intuitive information can include mind stuff, like the way that we organize that information, the way we process it and bring it into words and language, how we communicate in relationship with others. Could be some swords, but could also be some cups. So the mind is in all the suits, and at the same time, swords, patterns, and stories don't just engage the mind, they also engage the heart, the gut, the body, other parts of us. So if we come back to Catherine's question of why would the three be in the swords, I kind of concluded, and we'll talk more about that when we go through each card, but I kind of concluded that it's a heart-centered experience of a brain pattern or story. So even though the card has a kind of emotional feel with showing this heart, there's a reason why it's in the sword suit. Or you can think of the Four of Swords, which is, let's see if I can find it real quick. So the Four of Swords, this is the image, is very related, I think, to the physical body, to rest, to your energy reserves. Like how your physical brain can actually get really tired when you spend too much time wrestling with a particular perspective or challenge to that perspective. My own experience in neurodivergence of overstimulation really vibes with this card, because I think, I can be working with patterns and stories and then everything just shuts down. Physically, I can't interact anymore. So that's not just the mind that brings in more than that. Seeing it this way for me also really shifts how I feel when a bunch of swords cards show up in a reading. So rather than thinking, okay, this is pointing to the issue is mental, I now kind of think of it more as that it's saying, whatever the theme or the question, whatever I'm drawing cards for, I need to look at the patterns and stories that are involved in that thing. And the engaging with those stories is heart work. It's not just mental. Okay, so mind can be in all the suits. Swords is not just the mind. Swords is about patterns and stories. You might think of talking about the 4-element system. You might also think of the soul or the spirit as our highest expression. But I would argue that no single suit is soul. It's soul, I use that word to mean kind of the integration of it all. I know that some people who use the 4-element system do talk about kind of 5th element, and they might name it ether or spirit. I've seen sometimes there's like bonus cards in different tarot decks, and that kind of carries this idea of like integration or transcendence of the individual elements. I also think that thoughts, feelings, the physical, all of these things can obscure soul truth. It is possible to obscure soul truth when you're in just one of them. And so the minors, to me, and the tarot teach us that in order to get to soul truth, we really have to try finding it in all these modes. We have to do trial and error. We have to explore. And then the majors, to me, which we won't go into a lot here, but the majors are the really big milestones of the soul journey. And they some of them are associated with elements, but I think they work with all the elements. Courts also play with integration in a really interesting way, because they are double elemented. That's a talk for another time if you're not familiar with that. But if you do know what I'm talking about, you know that courts are double elemented, and so they play with different elements going together. So an exercise you could do if you have a deck, if you're a tarot person, and you're kind of fairly familiar with the cards, is that you might imagine going through the lines of the majors, like going through all the majors in order, and thinking about going through those as a member, as each member of a particular court family. So like page, knight, king, queen of swords, or you could do like page of wands, page of cups, page of swords, page of pentacles, and think about how each member of the family or a representative from each family with the same role might behave when they encounter those energies. So what happens when the page of swords shows up to the magician and then the high priestess and empress? And then how is it different when, say, the knight does, or the page of wands? That's a fun exercise. It'll take you some time, but you might try that. I think you have to find your own relationship to the suits. But one thing I noticed is that, I had a favorite suit, which was the swords, that I really identified with when I started out in tarot. And I've gotten to the point where I still have a soft spot in my heart for the swords, but I don't feel that I like really relate with just one, because tarot suits, tarot cards, they're not personality types, right? They're really about, tarot is about how you engage with every single card, because every single card is important. Every single card forms an archetype. So if you're new to tarot here, like we're really talking about, working with these archetypes, which you don't have to know the system, the entire system, or know how to read tarot to benefit from. But one key part of the way I look at tarot is that every single card can speak to every person. And so if a card, let's say the 3 of Cups, as I shared, and Jenna noted that they also kind of feel this way, feels daunting or challenging to you, it's not that the 3 of Cups can't apply to you, it's that there might be some more exploration to do. And my teacher, Lindsay Mack, calls it field study. There might be some more like observation and personal work to kind of figure out what that card means for you. All right. So we talked about why, we talked about the swords. Now we're going to talk about what, in my view, would be a healthy integrated sword suit. If we look at the suit as a whole and what I'm calling heart-centered swords, what is this all leading towards? If the swords are about stories and patterns and learning to work with them and discern and share the truth, discern the truth and share the truth, then what is heart-centered swords? Like, what does that actually bring us to? So I would say inner truth, inner knowing, higher self. I think the ultimate state of a healthy sword suit that's really integrated and worked with is radical acceptance. And then there's a tie here to justice. Here's another version of the justice card that I really like. That it is a release of all the stories and patterns that don't serve, using the heart as a guide. So I think that the swords teach us how to find the heart space and how to communicate from it. So you might think about like how cognitive dissonance can serve as a beacon that shows you that something isn't true, or even just critical thinking. The way when your brain is kind of like, or when you just start doing critical thinking, you can maybe see that something isn't true using the heart as a guide that is partnered with the mind. Those two concepts in integration. So I think the suit is really about awareness as opposed to, say, willful ignorance or learned helplessness, which is going to come up in some of the shadow sides of these cards, but I don't think is the like real raw essence of the swords. I think the swords are helping us to learn to refine our thinking, learn what to trust, learn how to be open to new ideas. They show us how to facilitate truth and meaningful communication, as well as intention. And for me, the swords are kind of a conscious mode as opposed to more subconscious modes of like the cups. I think the swords can teach us a lot about relating to others through verbal or written or signed communication. So the conscious parts of communication can teach us a lot about being in conflict, making choices, and setting boundaries. So finally, I'll just share, well, finally, not finally, I'll just share some associations for the heart-centered swords or heart-centered air element. And you can just let these kind of wash over you. Just listen, see what they spark in you. Some of those terms might be intellectual flow states, being driven by compassion to speak. Subject areas like theology, philosophy, metaphysics, language, and linguistics. Storytelling or receiving stories. Patterns that help us to organize information. How we symbolize and interpret our direct experience. One modality for love. Wise discernment and learning to make choices. Adaptability, flexibility, and rejecting absolutes in favor of filtering through context. And synergies between ideas. Balancing speaking and listening, or communicating and listening, communicating, receiving, because it's not always speech or hearing. Communication in a variety of forms, and sharing your truth. So those are just some phrases that I would associate with it. Like any suit, there are unhealthy expressions of this. So like there might be unhealthy expressions like self-judgment, guilt and shame can be thinking patterns. You can even think of cultural external things like capitalist logics and dogma, right? Like not every story is true. So the swords teach us to work with stories and patterns, not all of which are true, but we're kind of looking for truth and we're engaging the heart. When we're using the swords in a healthy way, I think we're benefiting from the power of like perception and discernment, using our values as a guide to kind of pull us back to center. And one thing I'll add, and then we're about to get into individual cards and take looks at them and talk about them, is that I think the air age that a lot of astrologers have been talking about, and no one agrees on when it starts and what signifies it, and are we there yet? Did it just start? Or have we been here for a while? Whatever. But if we just posit that we're either in an air age about to be or have been, I see the air age as a potential unifier. So I think where we are right now, that the mind is sometimes seen as separate from the rest of us. I even described, right, that I wanted to be separate. I wanted to be a disembodied head, but I couldn't be. It's not, right? It's not separate. It's part of a capitalist story of the perfect sort of disembodied mind. And I think that's really more about like an unhealthy expression of ego, not the highest potential of the mind. I've also noticed that in spiritual and creative communities, sometimes, so that's like one way of looking at it. And sometimes in these communities, we can actually compare an unhealthy expression of the air element with healthy expressions of the other elements. So that's almost another form of separation, where instead of prioritizing brain as best or logic as best, we're considering it the worst. And then it's something to overcome, to transcend. I don't agree with either of those points of view. I think that this air age, whatever it is a challenge to think differently about intellect and the mind. And so, for example, rather than equating the mind with like capitalism or elitism or even whiteness or binaries, like what if spiritual folks could reclaim mental energy as unifying? Like, what if all of us could do that? So you can think about like language and how language connects us and allows us to communicate. You could think of networks of people and how networks of people mimic like neural networks. So this is very Gemini, like Lover's Year kind of thing, I think. Just the beauty of like many varying perspectives, and you could think about technology or sci-fi or like the potential of dreaming. All of these like themes could be really nice. So, what if rather than prioritizing the mind over all else, what if those of us who consider ourselves more like mental could focus on an aligned, integrated mind that's connected with and it's in conversation with all of the senses? It's the part of us that processes, interprets, organizes the sensory information that we get, but it's not just the physical brain. There's some really interesting research. If you're a sciencey person or you're interested in science or the blend of kind of science and magic, there's some really fascinating research right now on the concept of the body mind and sort of like how we process trauma is one angle on that. The way the body stores memory. There's a lot of research on the gut as like a second brain, or just the nervous system in general is a fascinating rabbit hole to go down. And what I find kind of cool is that some of the recent research is starting to relate to more sort of supernatural phenomena. So we're starting to see connections between observable science and then what we might call magic. And I think the two are the same. So also, not just internally, but externally, like we know that we don't experience each mode of being in a vacuum. We're always doing all of them. All right, so now we're going to look at some cards, and feel free, again, thanks y'all who are engaging in the chat. There's a question about a freebie. Well, this is a freebie, and then you can sign up below if you want a free email series with resources. Also, I hope my audio is okay. Let me know if it's quiet or if there's any issues, because I can't tell. I'm just assuming it's fine. But we're going to go through the swords, so feel free to drop thoughts in the chat about the cards as we go through them. But I want to remind you as a starting point that tarot is not totally linear. So we're going to follow a sequence. We're going to go in order. But I've noticed that like one way actually of looking at the numbered swords cards that was helpful to me is that oh, thanks, Laura, is that they offer a kind of like series of exit points or choice points where you might jump out of the sequence. You might jump to another suit or to something else. You might loop back around. I'll point out some of those as we go. But I think that like overall perspective is helpful because I think it was Miss Avarice who mentioned the 10 of Swords being challenging. That it's not like it's a linear story where the 10 is the result, because we'll see that the 10 is pretty dramatic. We're not saying the conclusion is always the 10. You'll also notice as I talk that I don't have a single interpretation for every card. And I think that's just the nature of tarot. Like when you work with the cards in a reading, you might have one thing stand out. And it's beyond the scope of this presentation to really like go in depth on interpretive techniques or interpretation. But I think we can just learn from life about the system. And so I'm going to I love offering multiple things that could be true at the same time. And I'm going to do that as we go. All right, so we're going to start with the ace. We're not going to talk that much about the ace because it's pretty straightforward. So the ace is the rawest form of the suit, like any ace. And whoop. So it could be a new idea. It could represent a new story, a new mental pattern, a new perspective that you encounter or that you come up with. So we've got the sword kind of breaking through. I love the movement. This is from the Lubanco Tarot, kind of smashing through. I think Laura mentioned something about cutting through things, and that's really, really visible there. Here's another one that I like because it's like you can see the person's eyes are closed, but it's the human person who's kind of receiving from this like spiral of life. I think that's really beautiful. So the ace, a perspective, a story, a new mental pattern. And then we move into the two. So in two of swords, we're looking at discernment, making choices, giving yourself space to be with different options. By the way, if you don't know, I'm hard of hearing, so I'm very conscious of making sure I can be lip read and you can see the images. So I'll try to get them as close as I can without covering my mouth. So if the ace gives you a new perspective, maybe, then the two could be asking you to choose between alternatives. Like it might be between the new perspective and what you already had. It might be asking you to merge or combine or alchemize what you've learned, new information with what you already had. It can also, especially in this version, I think you can see it, represent a boundary against too much information coming in all at once. So if it is a choice, it's very clearly to me a solitary choice, a choice that you make alone after you encounter that pure perspective of the ace. I think it could also, even if you don't think of it as choice necessarily, I think it can represent the kind of taking the space to be with an idea and cultivate it. So it's cutting off with the blindfold, the external information, and it's setting a clear boundary. In this version from the Meraki Tarot, you can kind of see this iceberg idea, like cultivate. There's a lot more than just what meets the eye. The shadow side of the two is that there could be some risk in being in this energy for a long time. You could get a little entrenched with your own thought. That's possible. But now we move to the three. So I've shown this version of the three a bit. I'll also show a version. This is from the Light Seers. And you have this kind of sewn heart with, you can see the strings are pulling apart and you can really feel the visceral nature of this card. So the three to me is about the limits of individual understanding, the limits maybe of a single story. I have a few ideas in this card because I think this is a really important card to cover. It's why a lot of people are scared of the suit. So first, just a couple ideas that are derived from the numerology of the three. So 3 is considered to be a pretty stable number. One of the things I was wrestling with actually when Catherine asked me, or we had this conversation about the 3, was like, why would stability suck so much in this particular suit? I think it's the only one where the 3 feels like a bad thing. I don't think any one tarot card is good or bad, but like it's hard to say this is like super joyful, right? So possibilities. The 3 could represent a peak of understanding whatever it is that started in the ace. But even if it does, understanding isn't actually everything, right? It's not the peak of the suit. So it might be the peak of understanding that perspective, but it's not the end of the story. So it could reference like, who might you be hurting when you're super confident in your own understanding? So kind of the energy of like, I'm sure I'm right. I am right, right? I'm sure we've all had this. We've probably done it too, but we've probably all seen that person, right? Who's I'm always right, and that's been frustrating to us. It's like, yeah, you might be right, but is that the most important thing, right? And this card, I think, asks us to consider whether being right is the most important. It could be a kind of stubborn energy. So the mind might be really sure of something. And you might not even feel like there's conflict, but something is being injured below the surface. That might be what the heart is representing. The stories that we have in our brains can feel super real and super true, but I think you want to check in when you pull this card, especially with other modalities, whether you think of like the soul, the heart, the body, because the brain, and particularly that kind of monkey mind or ego, is all about survival. And survival is important, but it's a different narrative from the heart narrative, the soul narrative, the spiritual or universal narrative, maybe. And the best story to prioritize your survival may not actually be emotionally nourishing or spiritually fulfilling or why you're here on this planet, what you showed up to do. It might be, they might align, but they might not. You could even think, I think with this about intellectual accomplishment, or like even just like winning an argument, where it's like, cool, like I've accomplished something with my brain, I've made it to the 3, but then you're like, oh fuck, like that's not actually what has meaning in life to me. If you've been in academia, which I have, you can sometimes get to this point where you're like, cool, I published this paper, now what? Visually, you could even think of the swords here as almost like pinning down the heart. Like they're making the heart operate in a box and be stable, and that's not what the heart wants to do. Sometimes you may really identify with your brain when you pull this card, and you may be avoiding emotional processing. So you're not necessarily going to always have a super emotional experience with the card. And if you pull it and you're not, it might just be a little nudge to check in with the truth. Another idea from that numerology of the 3 and the stability is kind of about the consequences of your thoughts. So the physical swords in this card could represent kind of a long-held thought pattern or something that you are so mentally sure of that you don't even know what to do when it's proven wrong. Just like I said that understanding isn't everything, stability doesn't mean truth. So as an example, capitalism, specifically racist colonialist capitalism, is a very stable story. It's been stable for a really long time. And I would argue it's not true. It's based on a lot of things that aren't true and understandings of humanity that aren't true. You can disagree, but that's my point of view. So a stable story isn't necessarily true. So if in the 2, I'm starting to kind of make space to find the thought, make space to cultivate, develop it, understand where it fits into my worldview, then by the 3, it's like, oh shit, what does this thought actually mean? And your brain can start to spiral. Because like an idea or pattern or a story, you can be really into it and excited about it, and then you might get to a painful conclusion. Like you might hit the moment of realization of harm, or just the logical conclusion of something could be drastic. I think in current events, you can probably think of examples of where the logical conclusion, people carried an idea or thought or pattern out to its logical conclusion, and it's not pretty, like it's scary. Yeah. Danielle Park, who's over at Oak Moon Tarot on Instagram, talked about in a live over there about the 3 of Swords as the heartbreak. As heartbreak, yes, but not necessarily like romantic heartbreak or that kind of heartbreak. The heartbreak that you experience when you confront a tough truth and you move out of denial. It's that experience of cognitive dissonance. If I had to pick one key phrase for 3, it would be cognitive dissonance. That pain of, oh. And then the last idea I'll present, and then we'll move on, but I love talking about this card. The last idea I would present here, and let me know too if this is resonating or making sense in the chat, is a little less like numerological, but the 3rd sword in the traditional 3 swords version, the 3rd sword could represent other people's thoughts or judgments or words. So it could be like literally you could think of the 2, in the 2 we've got our own position, and then the 3rd one comes along like stabbity stab. It could be a confrontation or challenge to your own views where you have to kind of incorporate a new angle. And when you incorporate a challenge, a new angle, something that you didn't know before or didn't understand before, you kind of have to let go of the control that comes when you think you know something. You have to release your attachment to being right and to mental understanding as the pinnacle. So a question you can ask yourself when you draw this card would be, and you're not sure why especially, you could ask yourself, is there anything like related to my question or topic? What do I think I'm right about? Is there anything I think I'm right about? Or this position in a spread? What do I think I'm right about? And just ask you. Maybe you are, maybe you're not, but like that could be a prompt. I think part of the medicine of this card is about the dialectic, which is the idea. The dialectic is the idea that multiple things can be simultaneously true at once. And that's not really natural to our brains. So we can, especially the way we've been educated and raised, most of us. And so I should say that's culturally specific. So for me, it's not. And folks may have different experiences, but I have found it's not really natural. And so there can be a lot of resistance and like feelings that come up. And that may not feel great if we're not used to being in our feelings and uncertainty and kind of, that can feel kind of, but I remember like when I was a kid, like I really want to come back to this, like this dialectic, this idea of multiple things being true, because I remember when I was really little, it was so obvious to me that like even like very contradicting philosophical beliefs, religions, etc. I was like, yeah, they can all be true, right? Because what I'd learned, and I didn't grow up religious, but like what I've learned about theology in general was that, if there's God or spirit or whatever you want to call it, that God is omniscient and beyond human thinking. And so my little brain was like, great, I'm not supposed to understand it. It's fine, right? All these things could be true at once. And that's what I believe. And I've almost like circled back around to that in my like late 30s now, of that like child Avery perspective. You could even think on like a meta level, if you're thinking about specifically like this version or the Smith-Rider-Waite version, the image could even represent a particular worldview on cognitive dissonance and emotions as painful. So this image may come out of that culture, right? But maybe in another culture, this wouldn't be so painful. It wouldn't hurt so much to bring in more perspectives. So if the ace is raw perspective, and then in the 2, you try to kind of choose on your own what you believe or develop or merge the idea with your own. In the 3, you're like, great, well now I have to live around other people. So it's not a binary of like you as an individual or me as an individual gets to decide what is true and gets to figure it out. And it can be painful to realize like I'm not the hero of the story. I'm not the one who gets to decide. There's actually many, many different perspectives. All right, that was my big thing on the 3. Let's keep going. So we'll move along. So with the 4, it's like, okay, we have this thought. We're having this experience, but we can rest now. So if we have been harmed or we've caused harm, the 4 invites us to take a moment to process and not to immediately try to fix it with logic. So this is one way to think about it. Rather than responding immediately to that kind of third sword that we've been stabbed with and immediately starting to argue, to fight back, to get defensive, or maybe if it's not someone else, but we just realize the consequences of the story, rather than immediately trying to revise that story and staying in the mode of like mental pattern. The 4 gives us a chance to just put that down for a second. We're putting down literally the swords. They're not being held here. So you could think here of like the benefits of not talking when you realize you don't understand something, like making that space to listen, to process, to reflect, rather than immediately responding. I think is really represented by the 4. In this version from the Light Seers, I love this nest. And you've got that string and that heart from the previous card, but it's like we're putting it down for a second and we're resting. Jenna asks, what if that third sword of someone else was added to the 2, and then the heart and the heart that comes is the intimacy, vulnerability. Yes, of encountering someone else's perspective. Yeah, I like that too. So the cognitive dissonance is one way to think of it, but also, yeah, like the intimacy or vulnerability of hearing someone else's take and realizing it's different, and then that the vulnerability there sharing with you, and then the intimacy between 2 of you. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that contribution, Jenna. So another thing you might like think about with the 4 is that when you've been thinking about something forever, and you have that feeling where you're like, I'm losing it. Like I'm trying to solve this mental problem over and over and over, and I'm just losing it. And then you sleep on it, and then boom, you know the answer, right? And that phenomenon comes because we have to integrate. Like we can't just always be actively thinking all the time. We have to make space for passivity, for rest, for receiving, which is not something capitalist culture at least encourages. For literal body integration. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I have definitely had the experience of being like, oh my God, are we still going through this experience? Like, I still am dealing with this. And it's like, yeah, because you can't just think about it. Credit to my therapist. You can't just think about it. You have to be, and you have to integrate, and you have to allow it. So, yeah. So if the 3 might represent like a stable understanding or a fixed mental pattern, then the 4 is offering us a different kind of stability. It's more about what I would say stable. It's stable, right? 4 is also a stable number, but it's more about stable, loving acceptance, and coming to a point of openness or willingness, a point in which, as Jenna points out, you're able to be intimate and vulnerable and share. So it's not necessarily the 4 about the stability of the thoughts themselves, but it's more of a reminder that you are stable in relationship to your thoughts, that your thoughts come and go, that you are at the center. Carrie Mallon, if y'all are familiar with Carrie Mallon, on their blog calls this a centered mental state versus a fixed mental state. That also makes me think of, and I think I mentioned this in the email series next week, but the idea of lenses versus mirrors, I'll talk about a little bit. But yeah, a centered mental state versus a fixed one. So self-trust is huge here. A huge part, by the way, of my own work, like when I work one-on-one with folks, is around self-trust and like being in a place where you have tolerance for uncertainty and mistakes. Because I think this is really important. It's something I have grown a lot in recent years and in my whole sort of journey and will continue to do, I'm sure. There's a relationship here, according to Carrie, to unlearning. So it's about making space and time for contemplation, stillness, sort of other forms of just gaining perspective and space, listening. And it's kind of an unlearning of the productivity story. So we're talking about unlearning a lot in Monday's email, but there's this story of like always be active, always be thinking, always be talking. I don't know about y'all, but I learned in school, a lot about debate and how to win an argument and how to personally always have an answer. It's a very perfectionist like mindset. And the 4 pulls us out of that. So you can think about like contemplative practices like meditation, like sound baths, maybe body work, like all sorts of contemplative practices, movement, and how nourishing they can be for finding your center and getting you out of like an emotional or mental overwhelm. I think this card also points to the importance of quiet to be able to listen. So a centered brain is one that can listen deeply because it puts down the swords. It's not so focused on the story. It's more open and trusting that you are centered and you can receive. And it's the sense of kind of a container. You got the nest, or in the more traditional version, the bedroom. There is just a container for this processing. Okay. So now they get to the 5, and the 5 is all about consequences and it's all about costs. So this can be kind of a tricky card when you get it, because you might be, the way I was taught was that you don't always know. Are you the kind of perpetrator or the victim? So in this card, we have somebody who's kind of like hurt or stolen the swords and the folks are walking away defeated. And they look kind of proud of themselves. And sometimes it's unclear, like, are you the perpetrator? Are you the victim? Or a third layer, is your own brain the perpetrator? Which I'll explain in a second, but that can come up. So you might, one possibility, the kind of like victim possibility, is that you might, in this card, be ending up realizing that you're in a harder place than you thought. You might be grappling with the fact that you've been in pain for years because of a story and you didn't realize it. Or changing your perspective may just result in a loss of status, a change in self-image, maybe a change in your relationship to an unearned privilege that you have to grapple with. Or maybe the story you had is shattered and you don't know what's next. Right? You might like identify with the victim in that way. Especially if you kind of skip the 4. So I mentioned kind of choice points and exit points. If you don't take that time and space to process, you maybe will end up more like this perpetrator. You may end up doing something unwise. You may end up causing greater harm. And it's not to say that you're a bad person. If that happens, it happens to the best of us. But it's a risk. And so in that instance, like you might just get so entrenched in a story or an idea that it starts really spiraling out of your control. And you might double down, or you might really get attached to being right, or be attached or identify with the specific story and kind of be like, who am I if I let go of this story? Particularly with big overarching stories to behold. And then whether or not you took the rest time in the 4, you might just still be really grappling with the consequences, the limitations of a particular thought or a series of thoughts. Potentially, and this is the third option, potentially you can start seeing yourself as the perpetrator when you're actually not. And this is like a perfectionist mentality. And this blew my mind because I realized that was what was happening with certain ways in which I was pulling this over and over. And I was like, oh, okay, I get it now. So in the 5, either way, which like whatever interpretation, you're always really confronting the harm that's operating underneath the story. So it's about a fuller work with the messiness of reality. And whether you see the 3 as a wake-up call, or whether you're still kind of with the story in the 3 and you're really fully leaning into a story that's hurting you subconsciously, by the time you get to the 5, I think you're really being called to grapple with brain shit and to learn like what doesn't work. I note here that this is the first swords card that explicitly depicts multiple people. I think that's significant. So I think it can represent the way that we can kind of clumsily stumble into relationship when we start to see our own thoughts and opinions in perspective. And sometimes when we do that, we can actually do harm or like get really competitive as we're kind of adjusting to being in relationship. So I have for a long time thought of this card. When I pull this card, I'll sometimes think of like white anti-racism, or like a cis straight person's kind of first attempts to be on board with queer stuff. Or substitute any other example where someone with unearned privilege is confronting and understanding what it might be like to hold oppression in that area, to be oppressed in that area, to be marginalized. And as you may know, it's really common in that instance to kind of center yourself, and you can go way off the rails. You can be like, you can go down a rabbit hole of self-loathing and a lot of like emotional processing, where you're just kind of emotioning all over folks who are oppressed and don't realize you're causing harm. You be harming yourself. Or you could just be like really identified with being anti whatever the thing is, like anti-racist, pro-trans, not transphobic, whatever it is, and not be noticing or identifying with your own privilege. And that might come up. The 5 could come up for that. So we go through that conflict and that difficulty, and then we move into the 6. So with the 6 of Swords, we're moving into an alternative. So whatever story, perspective, thought, idea wasn't serving you, you're now putting it down and stepping away. You may not know where. In this card, you can't really see where the boat is going. But you're still making a choice to reject and turn away from harm, to reduce harm, to just get out of the situation you're in, even if it doesn't feel like a harmful one, even if you don't have a more positive story yet to rebuild. You may not have a new ace in hand at this point. So this might be moving towards a new perspective, moving towards integrating perspectives, even moving towards comfort in not knowing, like moving away from understanding as the most important thing, or a different relationship to the mind or to the story. So there's a strong theme in this card for me of trust. Knowing that onwards is the best way to go. This is a turning point. I think it actually has echoes of the Hermit, which I'll show. In the majors. Nice, Laura knows the 6 of Swords favorite minor. Sweet. In the Hermit, this lantern only really illuminates the next few steps. So there's a lot of self-trust, I think, that I find the Hermit to be a really useful anchor for, that shows up here as well. The presence, being in this moment rather than necessarily looking ahead and freaking out about not having a destination. if I can briefly make a personal note, I have found this to be really huge in my own journey. And it's why I do the work I do with clients and in my writing and my videos in a lot of ways. Because when you trust yourself, I think you have a really different relationship to uncertainty and change, which is natural in the world, as we all know. And you don't feel quite as like tugged around, even by really painful experiences. So it's not that you don't experience pain. But you can feel more centered, that centered being of the four. I have found more capacity to show up for things that used to be hard for me. So things like being in relationship or being in community or being in integrity around social justice, like moving out of the guilt and shame of like, how am I, all of that story, and moving into self-trust in my own integrity allows me to show up more. Paradoxically, it like builds capacity. And so one of the reasons like I love being a change doula is that I am taking my own really passionate belief in future possibility, and trying to make space for more people to have that experience by really like serving as a loving, intuitive support person, where I don't need to know where you're going, right, to help you get to a place where you can see possibility. So this card, I think, can really represent, whether it's me or someone else, can really represent calling in that kind of support, as well as working with all of our parts. If you're familiar with like internal family systems and therapy, or just if you've heard terms like inner child, inner caretaker, that's upside down. I mean, yeah, cool. In this version, you don't have the baby, but in the Smith Rider Waite, there's actually 3. There's a child here as well. So you can think of it as like inner child, inner caretaker, and then just yourself. You could think of it as other sort of inner parts, but pulling in support not only externally as you're moving forward, but also from your parts of yourself. You know, when we unlearn things, sometimes we really don't know what the alternative is, or we forget to consider even that there might be an alternative or what that is. Another example is I personally find, I've noticed this recently, I'm like, I think I just need a neurotypical buddy who will show me when my own neurodivergence is creating really rigid containers and be like, hey, Avery, that's another rigid container, right? Because I can't always see what's in the future, but I can see that where I am isn't working. Anyway, we move on to the 7, and now you're on the other side, or at least if you're not on the other side of that body of water, you're somewhere else. You're somewhere a little more stable. And kind of 2 ways you might be feeling here. You may be feeling really kind of like battered and wounded and beat up if you felt like you really identified with the victim in the 5. Or you may be really feeling like, okay, I get it now. I've gone through this hardship, but I'm good to go. You may have like really a sense of control. Like if I have X, Y, Z, I'll be complete. And now I'm here. That's very lovers work as well. I mentioned that we're in a lovers year. And we'll talk about that in the email series. I'm going to keep saying we'll talk about it in the email series. A lot of this will go in deeper. And so the myth of the linear story, the myth that like life is linear, which it isn't, can come up sometimes when you correct something. So like when you realize that maybe you've caused harm or you experienced harm or your story was wrong, you can sometimes then really grab onto something and be like, now I've got it right. And that's the end. But the story isn't over, right? The story is never over. And so if we see life as a spiral, if we see life even just as a like going all over the place, it's not linear. And so this can kind of represent that experience of feeling like, okay, I got it now. So the figure in this card could represent old defenses kind of creeping back in. So you see that the figure is looking over their shoulder. They have 5 swords. They got plenty of swords, but they're still looking at the 2 behind them, right? It's going to be kind of FOMO energy as well. So it might be the defenses of hypervigilance, like looking over the shoulder. The card, when you pull this card, it can be kind of a reminder that just because you were hurt in the 3 and the 5 doesn't mean that you need to be scared. It also doesn't mean acting from your own pain, and just like grabbing as many swords as you can. Again, we're back to like self-trust and non-linearity. If you don't expect that a pain you experience is going to be the last pain you experience, if you know that pain comes and then goes, then I think it can hurt. I've experienced that it hurts less when it comes back, that it's less reactive, because I don't feel like I failed when I experience pain. And this can be a reminder of that. When you're hyper vigilant, you can sometimes really dig into an identity and be like, okay, like I'm somewhere new now. This is where I live. Now I need to write the manifesto and to protect that space. Actually, before I get too into that, I will get too into that. I'm going to keep going on that. So you'll notice here, like, there's a kind of grasping energy because it's reaching back for the swords. Once it can be this energy of like, once you have let go of the idea and then you're like, okay, now what? Now what's next? You might not be fully in discernment and fully in your center and able to like tune in and trust yourself. You may feel like I need to grab everything and run. Here's another one that's like gives that kind of energy of like, you can see this person's dropping the swords as they run because they're running so fast. So you may feel like you need a lot more information before you can ever continue. Or just like you're grabbing for, you need something new to identify with. So like I said, like it's that energy of, this is my space now. I identify with this new thing, and now I need to protect it. So you probably can hear a little bit of that like internalized colonizing mindset coming up in this. The idea that like if something is good, then I need to own it and I need to protect it. Or the capitalist sense of like a false scarcity and threat. This feeling of like, even though I've got 5 swords, I need 2 more because I never know if I have enough. And so this card can, I think, help get beyond that understanding everything is being about protecting your individual safety. Even if you don't consciously believe in these stories, right? Even if you don't like identify as like, yes, I'm really into capitalism. It can still act on you. Or like in this version, you can kind of just see the weight of having too many swords and the bird can't take off in the rain. A gentler version of this also might just be that like, it might just be about learning that it's okay that a thought or a mental framework doesn't apply to everything. I think it really is one of these like you can't turn back cards. Like you're trying to turn back, but you can't. You've already started moving. Like you might relate it to like strength or the moon. There's certain cards in the tarot that I think are just really like you can't turn back energy. You're in it. So then we get to the 8, and so with the 8. If you cling really hard to and you identify with your hurt and you try to hold on to something that doesn't really work anymore to protect yourself, you might get trapped. This could represent the feeling when you do like resurface more layers of an old story that you thought you were done with, that feeling of like, oh my God, this again? Like seriously, like this again? Or just getting thrown back into mental work that you thought was done and feeling exhausted. It could also be like if you, in the 7, if you were kind of grabbing for something to fill the void, and then you realize that you're now holding another story that also wasn't really for you. I think that especially happens when you really rely on external authority. You might listen and learn that there is a new perspective in the 3 that you hadn't considered. And then by the time you get to the 7, you might take that on wholesale, but not have actually processed and considered it against your own self-trust. And now you just got another story that might be disproven. And maybe it's just, you're just bouncing around as people disprove your stories. But in the 8, you have the option to release and move forward. So even though this person is like, looks trapped, you'll know they could walk forward. They can't see that, but they could call in help. Or they could, they could shimmy forward. They could even, that doesn't look like super secure bondage to me. I think they could get out of that. So it's got this sense of your mind thinks you're trapped, but you're not really trapped in the 8. You're never trapped when you pull the 8. And so it's about, I think, learning sometimes to work with the brain, learning tools to work with the brain, and escaping that trap through new tools. Because the brain is really good at some things and it's really bad at other things. And it can get really stuck on past experiences. Like in the 7, looking back and operating from like, oh, I feel so beat up, or I feel so, however I'm feeling by now, by the time I get to the 7 out of 10, the 8 is inviting you to rely on your other modes. It's reminding you that, there are other things to process with, not just your logic. So I'm sure folks have been in your minds and had somebody kind of pull you out of it. And And I think it's really beautiful for this current moment of like, what do you turn to when your brain says everything is over, everything is going to end? I think a lot of us have been confronted with that. A couple other like options I really like. I love the way in this one, this is light seers. I love the way the figure in the mirror is trapped, but they're not really trapped. So like their mind thinks they're trapped, but they're not. And then this one is just a lovely celebration of like creativity and moving outside. It's a little not safe for work, so cover your kids' eyes for 5 seconds. But this one from the Lubanco, I love the like delight and the creativity and the feeling and the artistry that I feel in this card. All right, and then we get to the 9. So if you didn't get free, as it were, in the 8, or if you're just kind of still having trouble letting go of a specific story or pattern that's not working, if you're over-identified with it, you can't see an alternative, things can start to spiral and you can start to freak out. So you might think of the 9 as the highest point of the suit's story. It's a culmination before you're fully complete, or the climax before the resolution of a story, if you remember, like, was that 12th grade? the story arc. 12th grade North Carolina, might have been earlier for others. And this card reminds us that we cannot do anything alone or only using our mind. So again, it's both about the internal integration of multiple parts of ourselves and the external of not just us. If our mental energy all goes inward, it gets trapped, it doesn't have anywhere to go, and the brain operating on its own can make things way bigger than they are. My teacher, Lindsay, likes to say that like the brain loves to get you alone. It's almost like a predator in that way. There are healthy ways to work with the mind, but it can also do this. I'm sure we've all had the experience, and this example of like being up late at night, you can't sleep because everything's going through your mind. Here's another one. And the more you cling and control and try to do it with the mind, the more your body is going to kind of nope out. So speak of nope out and speak of the resolution of the story. Now let's get to the 10. So in the 10, here's 100%. You may have seen actually this specific Modern Witch version. You may have seen, because there's a bonus card, which I don't have on me, but where instead of 10 of swords, it just says everything is fine, which I love. But this is kind of a modern version of it. But you can also see this. So when you get to the 10, you can't logic it anymore. You have no choice. It's the full completion of a story, of a pattern, a lesson learned, a resolution. I don't think that the 10, so coming back to how it's nonlinear, I don't think that the 10 is about the failure of thinking as a modality. And that was when I first encountered the swords. It was like, great, we end with this? Seriously? But it's not about the failure of thinking. I think about the impossibility of separation or unintegrated thought. So it's maybe even the ultimate failure of every individual story, every story that's just one person's story, or even of just control, that we can't control really anything. No, that's not true. We can control some things, but like our brain can want us to really control, and the 10 says no. So that gets us through the numbered cards, and then we'll a little quicker just go through the quartz. So we've got the page. So the court cards in general, by the way, are the way I use them as invitations, as ways, energies to embody. And I think of it as the court cards have gone through all the lessons of the suit, and they've spent time with the things that we were just discussing, and they're kind of at a different level. And so the page has just gone through learning what heart-centered communication, what truth, what meaning look like. So they're really excited, and they want to leap forward and try out this new skill. You can see in this version, you have kind of the, like, yes, I'm ready to go, the hero. This version, I love this because this was me as a kid, right? Nose in a book, but perfectly balanced. Moving along, moving forward. So they understand the page, that connection is important to avoid the stress that comes from, say, the 9. So they want to talk to others. They want to share their ideas. They want to learn more. I feel like the page is this, like, I'm ready. I've got something to share. I may not know exactly how, but I'm ready. Then we have the Knight, and the Knight is just really like in flow, learning and sharing, and both giving and receiving information. They're workshopping ideas. They might want to write like a million blog posts and quickly develop ideas and quickly try them on. They might be in a lot of communication. It's a very fast energy, right? This horse, note that the horse, actually, some versions of the sword's a little more this way, but the horse, the rider, and the sword are all pointed in the same direction. So it's not just speed, I don't think. It's intentional speed. It's like really being, if you've ever been in like a real flow state where you're just writing and writing or talking and talking or whatever mode you might use. This one I like because you've got the eye of the horse, so it's got that direction, and then the like straight up, I don't know, it just feels very like, yes. And then this one, so you've got the figure running for the motorbike, and then it's this feeling of alignment. Everything is aligned. The energy, the universe is aligned. The bird is going with the direction of the figure. Okay, and then we get to the queen. So the queen, annoyingly, I have two white blonde queens. That wasn't intentional, but the queen is really a master of discernment. So they have explored a lot of ideas. They've done all that trial and error of the night. They've done a lot of that. Maybe they've experienced exhaustion or burnout. And so they know how to set boundaries. They will communicate, but they don't want to talk to everyone. So you'll notice that both of these, there's the boundary represented by the sword, like I'm here, I got it. There is an open hand, but there's also the sword, right? So they don't want to talk to just everyone. They have a framework, I think, to process new information and determine what's true. That's the discernment piece. They have a mental framework where they're able to pull in new things, determine what's true, determine what requires action from them and what doesn't. That's what you're embodying when you pull this card. They have access to a whole matrix of meaning because they've listened to a lot of people. They show their love through direct and honest communication that comes from the heart. And that may feel harsh if you're not used to it. So if you expect them to bend to you, then you're kind of shut out of luck. Because they're not rigid in their ideas exactly, but you need to both be within their inner circle, someone they want to communicate with, and you need to meet them in the middle if you want adjustment. With heart-centered communication and not demanding. If you come to them just trying to convince them of your point of view, then that's where the sword comes into play. They're also really good at creating containers. I used to love and identify with this card a lot. That was my court card, was the Queen of Swords, because I love my boundaries. I'll talk about that a little and share some personal stories in the email series. And then finally we arrive at the King. So the King of Swords. King of Swords is, so Queen, we're thinking about a lot about sort of like internal boundaries, discernment, communicating with people, but then how do you deal with the internal piece? The King is really big on sharing truth. And so they are also tied into that universal matrix of meaning, and they have no time for ideas that would manipulate or only serve a select few people. They lead really confidently from their access to that meaning matrix, but they aren't afraid to adapt with new information. If you try to logic them, if you try to mansplain them, if you try to threaten them, they kind of laugh in your face. They're experienced enough and they're wise enough to be really hard to ruffle because their ego is healthy and they know how to see everyone else's mental frameworks. So like in this version here, the King is holding a book that says truth, and the King still has to open that book, doesn't have it open necessarily, but they have access to it. So if you fuck with this King, they'll give you an idea to ponder and then they'll send you on your way. So this could be a spiritual advisor, a really good coach, or just anybody who speaks truth to power. Okay, so now we come back to finally and we'll have some time for questions if anyone has any. It's okay if you don't. But we come back to the Lovers and to Justice. So I think we come back to, and everything we've just gone through and learned, coming back to being heart-centered, but being about truth and the truth of love and a loving truth, rather than the illusions of separation, competition, superiority, or logic. So loving doesn't mean being complacent, and it also doesn't mean romance. This card, the Lovers, is not about romance. Going through the shit like this is a profound act of love towards yourself and towards others. So the Lovers really helps you, and this year it's really emphasized, to unpack stories of comparison, to unpack unhealthy narratives around what you need to be whole or complete. really helps you to uncover your own truth. So when you feel really pulled to comparison or not as good as someone else, not enough or too much, the Lovers is really a valuable ally in that work. And then Justice is like, look, this is not going to be easy because the human mind can never have a full lens on the truth. So you've got to go through these struggles and you've got to go through it, but the truth does exist and it is out there. Okay, so we're going to get into questions. Before that, just a few announcements, reminders. So you can go ahead and if you have questions or if you have just topics that you'd like to mention a take on or ask me for my point of view, please drop it in the chat if you've got that. But just a few quick reminders. So one is that if you're not already, be sure to sign up for the first link below to work through some of these ideas in your own life, because the emails next week are going to go deeper. They're going to tell some stories. They're also going to give you exercises that you can pick and choose from that engage various different modalities and levels of knowledge about tarot. Most don't require tarot knowledge, honestly, in your own life. So be sure to sign up now, because I'm figuring out what to do if somebody signs up late, and I'll probably get it to folks later, but you're not going to get it next week unless you sign up by the end of this weekend. So go ahead and do that now. And share. If you like this, share it with somebody. After the series next week, which will be a daily series, you'll get an email from me once a week or less if you opt out of some of my lists. And those lists include tarot and astrology education, so like more direct education like this through email, personal reflections on healing and justice in my own journey. And that's also where you can get an opportunity to work with me in a live session when my books open. So I'm cultivating a really magical experience that I'm super excited about. Right now, you can go ahead and book, if you just want a tarot reading, written or recorded tarot reading, you can book right now. You can go from that Heart-Centered Swords page or just queermagical.com and click on work with me and you'll see a link to book. But the live, my calendar is opening up in a week or two, limited slots for lives. And I'm super excited. I'm going to be offering some 90-minute sessions that are really supportive and intuitive, where I can read your chart. Sometimes I channel information. I can pull tarot cards, oracle cards. We might do body activities, somatics together, or just have a conversation and share tools. So I'm really here for anything you need, whether if you're just lonely in this pandemic and you need someone to sit and prioritize you and make a space for you and your experience. Or maybe you need some mentoring on tarot or on astrology or on developing a spiritual practice. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for ways to feel less guilt and shame, greater self-trust, support in unlearning harmful stories. If you're someone who wants to be a part of social change or is, but you're feeling kind of exhausted, or you just don't know how to balance yourself and others, please know that is coming to email, and you'll get that link. And I would love for you to sign up and book. We can do a session. We can also do a package for longer term support in my work as a change doula. You can also email me if you have any questions, just to reply on one of the emails that you get next week. So if you're looking for something right now, especially free content, I do have some posts on my Instagram at Queer Magical, especially earlier in Aquarius season, talking about topics like cancel culture and being in community and visionary work. And just a reminder that I do really do this from the heart, and I'm really looking for people, folks who my people, the folks that like resonate with me, whether or not you have financial resources. So send people my way. And if you don't have capacity to support me, please know that I am so glad to offer this work as a gift to you. And if you do have resources and you feel called because you've received value from my work or because you see the value that I'm providing to others, you can make that work more sustainable through the Patreon link. This is my full-time job. So the link is below. It'll be at the bottom of email. So, you can receive email for a while. And if you just feel called to do that, that's how. And because I'm small and I am growing as a business, I'm just acknowledging early supporters through a limited time deal called the Founders Tier. So that's $10 a month if you start giving at that level now, up until it cuts off forever on March 2nd on my birthday. So get in there if you're interested. If you go ahead and get in there, you'll be at that level as long as you support, and you'll get perks like discounts, early access, the first stab at an advice column that I'm writing for the email, so you can ask me questions, as well as a quarterly video where I'll be talking about the energies of the season, pulling cards, go kind of behind the scenes of my own process and my business. So it'll be sort of like being a board member for this whole experience that I call Queer Magical AF. And finally, if you got value from this and you want to support, but you don't really want to stick around, you just are like, how do I donate to you? That's okay. I prioritize sustainable contributions, but I do have a way to do a one-off. So if you just want to kind of pay for this and acknowledge that, it's paypal.me/Avery, AVORY. Okay, questions. Let's see if we got some questions in the chat. All right, we got a question from S. Thank you. What resources would you recommend? Yeah, so for new folks to tarot, struggling to feel confident with the cards. That's a great question. And it's hard, I know, because there's like a lot of resources and some of the kind of like, if you just look up beginner tarot, there might be like certain points of view that you don't agree with. So if you're on board with some of the kind of a little like radicalish ways that I engage, obviously, you can check out my own work. One thing that I do have on my YouTube channel is called Tarot Study, and it's kind of a slow series. Like we're only up to the Lovers at this point, but I'm going through each card one by one and really like integrating different teachers and talking about different POV and then like my own point of view and how they integrate. So check that out. But in terms of a comprehensive resource, so my primary teacher, her name is Lindsay Mack. And I love her to death, and I recommend her work to everyone. So you can, as if you're interested in just like a course or something, there, they are paid, but really worth the investment. You can go to lindsaymack.com, which is, I'll put it in the chat, spelled like this, lindsaymack.com. So you can go there for if you're looking for like a comprehensive tarot course. But other resources, I mean, she also has, so Lindsay has a podcast, Tarot for the Wild Soul, and then she has various things on the internet. If you just go to that website, like she would be my number one recommendation. I'm trying to think of other teachers. I have a lot of teachers, but I always just go straight to her. What would be good for interpretation? That's where I'd start. Yeah. Yeah, nothing else is like immediately jumped to mind. But if others have folks that have helped them, go ahead and drop it in the chat. I'll also just say beyond resources, one recommendation I would give you is that if you're struggling with confidence, so one thing is to remember that the interpretations of the cards do vary from source to source, and that's okay. I think having a deck that is fairly Smith Rider-Waite based, so one that like the Modern Witch as an example, one that kind of looks a lot. You could also just have a clone of the Smith Rider-Waite. I just like this because it's more diverse, it's more modern, so that you're not kind of struggling to match the cards you have to the learning you find is a good idea. But it's about self-trust. I know I keep saying that, but it's about self-trust. And so if you pull it up and you intuitively, let's say you pull, what's a good example? Like, let's say you pull this card, the 7. Now there's 7 of Wands. Now there's like various interpretations of this card, and you might sometimes look at this figure in the eye and be like, okay, that feels really like defensive or angry. And then other times you might look at this pose and be like, wow, that's a power pose. That's a defensive pose. And both of those come up in interpretations. So yeah, just like trusting the thing you get in the context of your reading. But there are a lot of good. Also, I might recommend Little Red Tarot is used to be a group blog, and that part of it's kind of defunct. But if you look at Little Red Tarot, the archives are all still there, and that was one of the sources. If you want something that's kind of queer inclusive, disability inclusive, anti-racist, etc., that was a really good curated blog for a long time. And there's an index of like by card where you can see blog posts on each card if you're looking for more. Jenna, not a question. Oh yeah, the hypervigilance. Yeah, 7 of Swords, absolutely. Laura asks, sorry, I keep giving your name because you give it on your YouTube channel. I hope it's okay to use your first name rather than calling you Aquamarine. I've clearly already cat out of the bag on that. What do you think about the tent in the background? Ooh, okay, let's look. Does this version have it? So I actually don't own a Smith Rider-Waite clone anymore, which is a little awkward for teaching. Maybe I should get one. But I just got so tired of like skinny white people that I couldn't anymore. But so 7 of Swords, does this one have the tent? I don't think it does. Doop, doop, doop. No. No, it's got a house instead. Yeah. You know, I want to answer honestly, I don't have any opinions on the tent because I have seen the image, but it's not one I work with a lot. So I would love, I know it's probably hard to type. It's too bad I can't like bring you on, but if you want to type in the chat thoughts on the tent or house. Okay. Yeah. If we go with, if this would be a reasonable proxy of the house, and I'll show it again. So yeah, is this sort of close to the same idea? I can't like in my head remember running away from the house. So I tend to think of this stability, whether it's a house or a tent, and the feeling of the energy I get here is that these swords all belong to someone. So you might one of the interpretations that's more sort of traditional that I've seen a lot is that the Seven of Swords is about strategy, even theft or deceit. And I think that comes from the idea that there's this house, which is like maybe the happy people, the stable people, the whatever people, and that this person is coming in with like a thief in the night and stealing swords and leaving two behind. I have a lot of dislike of that interpretation, especially with this one. I do not like the idea, right, that the figure is a black woman, femme. You know, I don't know the figure's intended identity, but like that feels real gross to me. Running away with the swords. But what I do think it could represent maybe in my view of the seven being about like hypervigilance and grabbing it too much, is that it might be that you're looking to something that feels or seems like what you want and you can't access it. So you're grabbing what you can. So earlier, you know, when I said kind of like you might be grabbing at possible ideas or stories or perspectives, it may represent that those aren't for you because you're not in the house. That's not your house. And it's not to say like, you know, I actually don't like, I think there's such a thing as righteous theft. I think ownership and property sort of sucks. So I could probably, if I thought on it more, I could probably come up with a whole anti-capitalist interpretation. But at its base, I think, yeah, it feels like looking back towards that house, and there might be a sense of like, other people have it all together. Other people understand or have a story or idea. So I need to grab one. That's off the cuff what I would say. But if you want to type some thoughts of your own, feel free, because I'm curious. And if anyone else has questions, feel free to drop them in. I'm thinking I'll stay around here till top of the hour unless everybody is just done. But yeah, if any like questions, reflections, thoughts. Also, no question is too basic. Or if you want to, if anybody has questions about the other, obviously this is swords focused, but like about the majors that I showed or the other minors, I'll allow time. I'm trying to think of other good beginner tips. Yeah, so Jenna notes that it could be like the house of childhood or upbringing. Ooh, yes. And that stability that may not even be healthy. Oh, I love that. Grabbing what you can. I like that. Grabbing what you can. That's an interesting kind of add-on, like, and kind of a more positive take on it that I didn't present, but that I can totally see as another way of thinking of the seven would be that once you get through the six in that boat and you get somewhere, that you don't leave everything behind. You're not like completely changing, but you might need to discern, again, discernment, and grab what is useful. So I really like that. Asking ourselves, what patterns do we leave our childhood or house from? Yeah, and I like that in this one too, that whenever I see like a house like this in the tarot or something that feels really like what, not necessarily maybe wealthy or middle class or just like real traditional, I always start thinking my own relationship to traditional values and traditional, like it's a relative term, but and like aspirations and goals. And so I can definitely see that as like what is this figure's relationship between those. Our Lady of Sorrows. Ooh, okay, that's probably a Catholic thing that I don't know about, unfortunately. But if you want to say more in the chat, if others maybe relate to that, I'll show the 3 again. I can't help but see Our Lady of Sorrows in the 3. Is that like a Trinity thing? Because I know there's a Trinity. So by the way, I have basically no Christian background. I mean, like, other than growing up in the United States, but I don't have family Christian background, so I don't know all the references. But that's the 3. So yeah, I'm sure it's a good association. I just don't know it personally. Yeah. Yeah, it was a really interesting, actually, this could be a beginner recommendation too. So I've been focusing on the Smith Rider-Waite, and this is the system that most of the kind of more pictorial versions, it's not the only one, but it's one of the more common ones, derived from. There is also the Tarot de Marseille, which is the older version that has what are called pip cards. My understanding, although I don't know Tarot de Marseille, but my understanding of it is that it is more like not derivative in a bad way, but like derives from number and suit, and has a lot of space in there for like your own interpretation. I believe The Way of the Tarot is the book that a lot of people recommend. I know Tom Benjamin is also somebody on YouTube that folks have recommended before. I can't personally vouch, again, I don't know Tarot de Marseille, but the interpretation I came up with, the 3, where it's like we're going, where Catherine asked me that question, and I was like, how do that's how I started. I was like, what happens if 3 and swords go together? And so you could do this with any card you're struggling with. You could ask yourself, what does it mean? Now, you would need to know a little about numerology and what the numbers mean, but you could just Google basic numerology, and then like attach them to the suits. And that could also be a way to personalize and find meanings that are like personally resonant with you, because no interpretation is wrong. I also think that when you pull a card, a lot of times and you feel, so if you're struggling with interpretation, another thought, if you're still around us, is that if you struggle with interpretation, when you pull a card and you feel like confusion or resistance, or like, no. Sometimes it's about your relationship to the card and that reaction you just had, not about the card itself. So like when I pulled 3 of Cups, I think a lot of times it was actually having me think about my reaction to that image was the thing I was being invited to. I feel like in the 7, there is a taking what works for you, not just taking everything that is there. Absolutely element. Yes. And definitely some of the righteous theft. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so like one big part of my worldview is that, and we'll talk about this section, emails next week. There's some anti-capitalism in those emails. Trust me. But one of the things we'll talk about is how it is about needs, and how my worldview is that if we really focused on our capacities and needs, which I think the swords do get to and the whole tarot gets to, then we would have better alignment, and we wouldn't have so many haves and have nots. And I think the 7 can totally speak to that this person may in fact really need these swords, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's asking yourself, how many do I need, or which parts of it do I need? So there's no such thing as too much need, right? Some of us, again, like I'm come from, disability justice background. Some of us have needs that are quote unquote greater in some areas than others, and may seem really extreme. And so it's not about a number, and it's not about like 5 or 2. It's more about checking in with self. And rather than having this like always looking away from myself energy, how can you come back to the center, identify your needs and your capacities to hold the things that you're taking with you, and then joyfully run away with the swords. So that might be more of a righteous stuff. And then, yeah, the taking what's for you, because I think what we get to, and why anti-capitalist in a way is, and some of the problems of our current money system is that we learn that security comes through holding as much money as possible that isn't being used. And we'd have a much more aligned ethical system if we focused on needs. But again, being honest about needs is not shaming anyone's actual needs or being like perfectionist about, well, let's 0.5 more swords than you needed. No, it's just about coming back to center. So cool. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions are totally welcome. Thank you all for coming, by the way. I'm so glad that you're here. I know a lot of folks couldn't make this time, and so people are watching the replay probably, which is also cool. I'm going to look up that Lady of Sorrows thing, though. Miss Avarice says, one of the teachers I follow says the message is not the message. Yep. Your reaction to the message is the message. So true. Yeah. And that's why I don't think that like a single book or a single teacher, even Lindsay, as much as I love Lindsay, right? Why I love Lindsay Mack is because she is constantly saying that like I'm not right. She's always saying I'm not the expert, I'm not right. You're right. The tarot is a tool for your relationship with yourself. When I say like that I help people to find themselves and their roles in the future, in an emerging future, that's what I'm talking about. I can't find you, but I can help you find, right? I can like support you in finding you. And so tarot teachers and mentors, and I do mentoring, but like tarot teachers and mentors and sources and bloggers and whatever, all of us are drawn to this tool because of how it helps us work with ourselves. And sometimes our interpretations can come off as very like rigid. And Lindsay doesn't do that, and I try not to do that in my work. Because I really believe that I can help guide you. I can give you some different ways you can think of the cards. That's what we do in the Tarot Study series on YouTube. But really, it's about your relationship. And the tarot is a tool that could speak to anyone. But our experiences are culturally specific, personally specific, brain specific. A lot of what I've shared today comes from my experience of neurodivergence, for example. You might not be neurodivergent, and that might not resonate, and that's okay. Ten of Swords. Oh yeah, I'm curious how you feel about Ten of Swords. What I shared. Ten of Swords leaves me questioning how my patterns and beliefs are limiting me from my full potential. Yes, yeah, because I think that it's like I said, like I don't think it's that patterns or stories are all harmful in and of themselves. They're useful tools in context, but I think the 10 is pointing to how patterns and beliefs that don't serve you, or patterns and beliefs that are out of context, or that you've held on to, maybe you've held on through the entire suit, and every time there was an exit point, you went, no, I'm still here. Sometimes you get a kick in the face. Like it's tower energy too, I think. Like if the tower card is like this too, where like if you didn't figure it out yourself, something's gonna come along and go, and I know like Lindsay has taught, and I don't know if she still does, but Lindsay has taught in the past at least, talked about the like 10 as being kind of letting go of the mind and moving into the cup suit and emotions. And I don't love that read. So here's a place where I differ from my own teacher. I don't love that read because I still want to bring the mind with me, but I want to work with the mind. And I think the figure in the 10 of Swords is like, actually, I like that the 10 in the Modern Witch is looking at their phone. It's like they're literally being stabbed on the ground, but they're still, I can't find it, but they're still looking at their phone. And I think shows the kind of like I'm attached to this thing that doesn't work. Okay, I have a few more minutes if anybody has anything else, but if not, we can totally wrap it. And when you pull 10 of Swords, I think, because I've been talking about these as archetypes, now you can work with them and use them, but when you pull 10 of Swords, I think sometimes it is telling you like there's probably some pattern or story that you're done with. There's something that you're done with. And sometimes it's affirming or validating. So if you pull it and you're like, yeah, I did just get rid of something. It's saying, great, good, that was the right idea. Jenna notes that it could be like retrograde. Yeah, how painful it is to go with the flow of primary motion. Yeah. So Jenna and I have been talking about this privately. Primary and secondary motion is the whole astrology thing. I won't get too into it, but it's the idea that like the planets, naturally speaking, are kind of want to go one way and are always being tugged the other way. And that when they're in retrograde, they're actually in some ways more easeful and more sort of with the flow, or maybe the rawer version of their energy. And I if you look at my Instagram and you go back a little bit, it's like a dark red post and it says something about retrogrades. I did this like anti-capitalist retrograde post out of this conversation with Jenna, because I think that flow and that ease, it's like, if you're just trying the productivity, and then you're like, oh, somebody might say you're going backwards, and you might say, yeah, I'm going backwards, right? So it's all a matter of perspective. Denise, just realized how meta this is. I've been stuck in certain stories of that. Yes. Oh, you made my day. That's perfect. I love that. It is kind of intentionally meta. Like, I could tell as I was building it, right, that it was going to be a little meta. It really is. Yeah. Because I think our relationship to the swords themselves can be limiting. So I'm so glad to hear that. I like your sharing multiple perspectives. Yeah. And so the question might tell us, for example, with the 7, the topic or question, our reaction, do I feel like I'm really in a grasping place, or do I feel like, and so this will be recorded, you can go back to it. So if you ever I'll try to timestamp if I can. I'm not sure I can timestamp it live, but if I can, I will, each of the cards, so that you can just hop to the point in this video, and try a couple out, based on the theme. Cool. So I think folks are starting to be good in wrapping up. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, we are at the hour. So thank you so much for coming. Again, make sure you're signed up to get the emails. That's the best place, honestly, is just to be on my list. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and it has been a pleasure to have you. And if you're watching this way in the future and you got to the end, thanks for getting to the end. And you can just go to queermagical.com to sign up for the newsletter in general there as well. So thank you all. Thank you. And have a good one. I'm going to close out the live. Everybody have a good night.